Good afternoon. My name is Katharina Möller, as well, most of you know anyway. I'm the researcher for the who did the Austrian disco study together with Ray Carl for the International Austrian Archaeology Forum. Okay, the first thing we looked at was the number of archaeologists in the country, and we tried to estimate the total number. Therefore, we asked archaeological organizations about staff they employed on the cut-off date, 1st of June. The responses we got were 1,069 archaeologists and 354 support staff. However, those numbers include paid staff as well as unpaid staff. Since not all organizations replied to our survey, we tried to gather more data with internet research, and from that we estimate that the total number of employees should be 1,219 archaeologists and 394 support staff. That sounds very nice, especially if you compare it with the data from the last disco study in Austria. The total workforce, if you just look at those numbers, would be 67% higher than in 2008, and 44% where archaeologists are concerned. However, as you can see, in 2008, the study was conducted in February, so the change in numbers could be influenced by seasonal fluctuation, and it could also be influenced by changes in the ratio between full and part-time employment, which is why we checked what those figures correspond to in terms of paid full-time archaeological posts. And in June 2013, that would be 679.5, and in June 2008, an estimated 507. So there is still quite a big increase, about 34%, even if it's not as big as it appears on first glance. Also, as you can see, over 70% of archaeological organizations in Austria have less than 10 employees, so companies or organizations in Austrian archaeology are quite small. We also took a look at age and gender. In terms of age, the average age is 43 years. 45 where males are concerned, and 41 years when it comes to females. These ages, or average ages, are slightly above the national average. In terms of gender, 51% of people employed in Austrian archaeology are male, 49% female. That is roughly inverse to the general gender balance of the Austrian population. This gets really interesting if you look at the gender balance across the age groups, even though what I'm about to tell you is nothing new, we've heard it before today. In the age group up to 45 years, the majority of archaeologists are women, 53.6% to be precise. And in the age group 46 or above, 64.6% are men. In the end, that means that in the higher positions you have older male archaeologists which then obviously are the ones that earn most of the money. Yeah, and he's not in the Austrian study anyway. So. Yeah, so as we've heard before, the top positions are usually held by male archaeologists over 46 years of age. In terms of nationality, 25% of archaeologists working in Austria are foreign nationals. Most of these, actually 46% of the employees of non-Austrian nationality are Germans. So language is obviously important if you want mobility. Another thing we looked at were qualification level and training needs. In general, Austrian archaeologists are very highly educated. We looked at archaeological qualifications, so basically degrees in archaeology, and we also looked at the general qualification because in the German-speaking countries, archaeology isn't archaeology. So, well, technically somebody who does ancient Egypt wouldn't classify themselves as an archaeologist, but as an Egyptologist. So even though for this study it's both archaeologists. So anyway, in terms of archaeological qualification, 93% of archaeologists have some form of academic degree. 90% of those an MA or higher, and 57% have a PhD or a postdoctoral qualification, the so-called Habilitation. If you look at the general qualifications, those numbers change slightly, but still nearly half of all people working in archaeology in Austria have a PhD or a Habilitation. We also asked employers about if they think their employees would need training of some kind. And in fact, 68% of organizations identified a need for training, but they don't offer training opportunities to all kinds of staff. They offer the most training opportunities to their core staff and staff that is paid out of the organization's budget, whereas other types of staff have hardly hardly any isn't quite correct, but have much less opportunity for training. And even the core staff, I mean, organizations said there's a training need, but only 26% of the responding organizations reported that they have a staff training strategy or plan. So even though a lot of them say our staff would need training, they don't put any measures in place that would make people actually take them up on those offers. And I mean, yeah, training in these terms usually includes stuff like going to a conference, buying books. There are no, let's say, courses you can go to once you graduated where you could actually learn something that you would need for work. Okay, terms of employment. First of all, both duration of contracts as well as full and part-time employment depends on the type of contract. You can see this quite clearly, for example, if you look at the duration of contracts here. If you only look at paid staff or staff paid by the organization, it looks like we have a lot of permanent places. In fact, 52% are permanent or long-term. Long-term in this case means 3 years or more, and only 23% are temporary with durations of up to a year. Whereas if you figure in, for example, AMS-funded staff as well, then the majority of contracts last 6 to 12 months. That's 53% of all contracts. And permanent and long-term are only 26%. So, yeah, which is why we separated between those two. The same, more or less, goes for full-time and part-time employment. 56% of paid staff have full-time contracts, 27% part-time, and 8% minimal contracts. And the percentage of full-time posts in Austrian archaeology is considerably smaller than the national average. If you figure in voluntary and AMS-funded staff as well, the percentage of full-time posts drops to 38%, and that of minimal employee staff goes up to 35%, which a lot of times are volunteers and the like. So we also took a look at the salary, which was not quite easy because not a lot of people actually wanted to give that information. It's usually not something you ask in Austria. So in 2013, the average gross annual salary of paid employees in Austrian archaeology was €27,091.52. However, the reported salaries varied from a minimum of €8,400 to a maximum of €68,000 per year. So, yeah. And in 2008, the average gross annual salary was €31,518. So, yeah, we have more jobs but less earn less. Compared to the average gross salary of all Austrians, employees in Austrian archaeology seem to be paid above the national average. However, even though we seem to earn more than the national average, 36% of archaeologists in Austria earn less than the average. And since commercial archaeology companies were underrepresented, only 2 of those organizations answered this question. This figure is likely to be much higher. Okay, the development of the archaeological labor market in Austria. This is where my title actually comes from. When we asked in the last Discus survey what people would expect, they said they expect to lose a lot of jobs in Austrian archaeology. In fact, on average, posts since 2007, when the survey was last conducted, had increased. And this time around, organizations are a bit more optimistic. They at least, most of them at least expect numbers not to change much in the next couple of years. Some even expect an increase. So, yeah, and with that, yeah, just a short conclusion. We have more jobs than in 2008. The majority of Austrian archaeologists have high academic qualifications. There is low job security. For example, we have a high turnover rate and more part-time employment than the national average. The salaries are lower than they were in the last fiscal study. There is a demand for training, but not many opportunities are offered. and the sector is, well, expected to grow slightly, or at least to stay at the same level as it is now. However, I think we, again, might be a little bit too pessimistic, at least I hope so, because since the end of this study, there were a few new developments. For one, Austria signed the Valletta Convention and the Faro Convention on 5th of June. Better late to the party than never. They're not ratified yet, but at least the conventions have been signed, and it's expected that they will soon be ratified. Also, the Austrian Standards Institute is working on an Austrian industry norm, a so-called Ö-norm, for pre-building development works, including preemptive archaeological measures. If these things should develop as it looks now, they will have consequences for the development of, well, they may have consequences for the development of the archaeological labor market. For example, in the commercial sector, they will possibly increase private sector funding if developers are required to provide funding for preemptive and/or rescue archaeology. And in the public sector, they might increase community archaeology. Okay, so, and with that, thank you for your attention. You can find the study online. I've been running through the numbers, kind of. If you want to look anything up, it's online. Feel free to do so.
Thank you, Katharina. Again, some positive news there, and some interesting developments that I think are going to consolidate aspects of Austrian practice. We look forward to hearing more. Is there a quick question or any observations? Two. Well, Andrew, I think I saw it first, and maybe you were first, Andrew.
Sorry, I'm just wondering about the process during cut-off. Is still, you have any kind of way of predicting what difference there will appear if you had the cut-off that had the data in your internet, or do you have any kind of...
We got data from the short networks that are out. So we'll kind of track that.
But that gives idea of new jobs open from that people can work.
Yes, but I mean that is one way of getting close to it, because it shows a certain seasonality and that you can figure in.
And I mean, just quickly, if that's okay.
Yes, you have an increase of jump, lower salaries. Isn't that because you have young people entering the labor market with low wages? So that will make the average lower?
Well, yes, partially, but I think it's mostly due to the fact that more commercial companies somehow operate, even if we don't have much data from them. And they pay lower than the public sector. So that brings an understanding.
I thought it would be logical if we had an increase of 34%. With a lot of young people
that certainly plays a role, but I mean that is probably increased by the fact that they come mostly into the commercial sector, and so they're young, they're getting lower salaries anyway, and they're getting even lower salaries because they're commercial.
And one quick, very quick point.
Did the existence of Disco 2008 for Austria, has that affected things? Has that affected the nature of the labor market? 5 years later?
Yes.
That's good.
And that was the notes. I'd like to invite our next speaker. I'm sorry, I've got lots of them. Come on, Kerry, come and join us. I do apologise. I welcome Kerry to tell us the situation on the Irish.
No. What I submitted.
More broadly,
It's
sorry.
in there, but
Okay.
unexplained.
Explain to me. I'll sit down and listen.
Off-putting. So nothing in the way of the screen. Okay, so slightly different to most of the papers that have gone before me. I'm not speaking specifically about Ireland because I have done at the last conference and also at the conference in Rome, and about the changes between 2008 survey and the 2013 results for Ireland. And I'll touch on it a bit as I go through this talk, and obviously I have sort of an Irish bias, but I really want to talk a little bit more about one of the aims, I suppose, of this project and the previous project, to do with the archaeological training and really what qualifications people in the workforce have, but also what they kind of wish they had, I suppose, or really more correctly, what their employers wish that they had. So aptly enough, I suppose, in an archaeological context, the sort of theme of theory versus practice will be kind of dominant, I suppose, throughout this talk. So we all have obviously aspirational or theoretical ideas of what training and skills we would like, but there are obviously lots of practical constraints within that. So, you know, not to mention the cost of them, the time involved, but also what exactly to get, and you know, where to go to get this suitable extra training and the recognition for it. A second theme of the talk really comes under what we've heard about a bit before, and the sort of EU mantra of new skills for new jobs. And as you can see, this agenda really aims to anticipate future skills needs in order to better match skills with the labour market, and basically to close the gap between formal education and working life. So I'll just talk a little bit about that. And so in order to look at these themes in the context of European archaeology, I have just taken case studies from 6 of the countries that have participated in the current DISCO project. So you can see there, obviously my own, as I said, I'll be a bit biased, the United Kingdom, Austria, Estonia, Slovenia, and Italy. And thanks to all of my colleagues who put their reports up on the website in which I could access the data. And I hope I correctly represent them, but you can obviously tell me when I'm wrong. And also something to point out as well is, of course, that many of these countries had different reactions to the economic sort of global crash of 2008, although we'll see that there's a lot of similarities between the countries. So if we begin then by looking at the role of third-level education, it's very clear, and we've heard this throughout the morning, that these countries are really very well educated in the archaeological sector, all pretty much very well educated. The vast majority, ranging from between 84 to 100% of the workforce in all the countries I looked at, has at least a primary degree in archaeology or a related subject. And as you can hopefully see from the graph, the differences really sort of develop more in relation to postgraduate qualifications. While in Ireland and the UK, the percentages with a master's is high, those percentages, those that proceed on to PhD or post-PhD level, are still comparatively or relatively low compared to the other countries that I looked at. I think the reasons, of course, for these are very complicated. They range from obviously costs of third-level postgraduate qualifications within each country, the number of scholarships available to the minimum level of academic qualification necessary for particular roles. For example, in Austria, we've probably seen that anyone really who wants to make a career in archaeology beyond the sort of level of field worker has to have at least an A-level qualification. While in Estonia, it is not possible to become self-employed, for example, without a doctorate or sufficient financial capital. Whereas in Italy, then, you need to have your School of Specialization qualification, which is sort of comparable to a PhD, and that's mandatory in order to be actually able to apply for certain jobs. And then within Ireland, the requirement for a PhD, for example, for an academic position is relatively recent. And then also grants for postgraduate studies in Ireland have really, through the humanities, have really been only in existence since 2000. Another aspect of qualifications within archaeology to consider, and I think we maybe talked about it a little bit this morning, and it's particularly obviously relevant since the economic downturn, is that of so-called brain drain due to immigration. In Ireland, for example, there's been an 80% reduction in the number of people working in archaeology since the 2007 DISCO survey. So that's obviously a huge difference. So we felt when we did the survey, that it was also important, where possible, to gather the data on those individuals who had left the profession, and indeed who had left the country but stayed in the profession. Of those that had immigrated or indeed returned to their own home countries from Ireland but were still working in archaeology, most of those individuals had a postgraduate qualification, and 48% had a doctorate or postdoctorate. So then again, this idea of brain drain, as it were, may be affecting the archaeological community post-economic crash. And certainly recent national statistics within Ireland say that 47% of people leaving the country have a third level education, and it's really pointing at the moment towards people not even really attempting to get work before they leave. They're basically leaving before they even begin with the job search. So given these very well-educated individuals, it would be fair, obviously, to assume that the employers would be satisfied with the graduates that are entering the workforce. But of course, we know that that's not the case, and that there's a big difference between being well-educated and being well-qualified to undertake a specific job. So this is really very much highlighted by the dissatisfaction with the skills levels of new graduates that many employers expressed in the DISCO surveys. And this has very much been previously discussed by lots of people, including Kenneth's 2004 World Archaeology paper. When the employers in Ireland were asked if they took on new graduates, for example, 80% of them said that they did. But when they were asked if these people were well equipped, basically half of them or more said that they were really definitely not. And I think 30% said that they were just adequate, which nobody wants to hear that they're just adequate. So I think this is a big problem that we're having at the moment. And it's also much worse than those that reported it 5 years ago, when only about 20% of the employers at that time believed that those young archaeologists that were coming out of the universities that they needed, that they were poorly trained. So it seems that I don't know, there's something not quite adding up there. So employers seem to be less satisfied, even though they should have their pick of the bunch at the moment. In Austria, approximately half of the employers indicated that they would also take on new entrants to the profession, but about 42% said that these were not prepared for jobs in archaeology, and then another 37% that they were only moderately prepared. And then similar, 57% in Slovenia indicated that they would take on new entrants. But in contrast to the other countries, most of these believed that these individuals were well prepared for the job. And although this seems like quite a positive thing, in contrast, of course, to the previous DISCO, it's less so, because the number of employers that are willing to take on these new graduates has actually dropped quite significantly. And the number that believe them to be ill-prepared has risen. So again, it's this sort of balancing act. And the UK report also indicated that in 5 years since the 2007 survey, very few positions were created that were then subsequently filled by new entrants. So similar scenarios. Significantly, when the same questions were put to the individual archaeologists in Italy, 92% of the individuals themselves believed that there was a big gap between their university education and their working life. And these were predominantly related to professional practice, practical experience. And this really seems to be an issue time and time again, that experience is their biggest obstacle for the employers. They generally believe that the universities are not providing sufficient training from everything, really, from site planning to site safety to regulations and so on. In retaliation, of course, the universities argue that it's not their remit to generate good quality archaeological practitioners at the undergraduate level, particularly given the fact that we've seen, I think it was already mentioned as well today in relation to the UK stuff, that so few of these graduates or actually proceed on into the archaeological profession. In fact, I think it was about 2001 that John Hollis estimated that in the UK, just 15% of new graduates actually went on to seek employment in archaeology. So that's quite a disparity. So it does very much seem that employers believe one thing and the trainers another. But despite this division, we've very much known about it for quite a while. It just seems to be this gap between both seems to be widening. A lot of this, of course, you can argue is to do with universities' budgets and restrictions on budgets, and obviously a lot of new regulations coming into it, health and safety and so on. And I think this has definitely affected many situations, particularly I think in Ireland. It's affected things like providing training excavations for students, the costs, the health and safety, and so on, and that has a big impact. But it is also interesting to know that in Austria, participation in an archaeological field school is a compulsory part of the curriculum for most archaeological degrees, as far as I understand it. But still, even then, with that practical experience behind them, the new students into the profession are not seen as skilled enough. So again, we're trying to figure out how we can get that balance right. And certainly, it does indicate that practical fieldwork experience is not the only thing that's not the only missing ingredient in this sort of employability aspect for archaeology. When employers were asked about the types of training they provided, many indicated that both formal and informal job training, or sort of internal training, is used, and this is often alongside external training as well in some cases. For example, in Estonia, it is reported that 52% of their permanent employees, but only 4% of their temporary employees received training. And similar situation in Ireland, where about 64% of permanent employees got internal in-job training, but only about 9% of the fixed term or temporary staff. So again, we have problems with contract types and how that's affecting people's ability to upskill and undertake additional training. In the UK, as you can see here, 82% of employers used informal in-job training for their paid employees, while 78% used the same method for unpaid staff. So this just gives you some ideas. So I think overall, if the archaeological employers could really convert in an ideal world, all of this informal in-job training, they could provide a sort of, maybe convert it into a sort of a more measurable and a more focused thing, then it would be very much a win-win situation. So really, I suppose it's about trying to establish systems of validation for this kind of learning. So it's sort of standardizing it and validating it and making it more formal. Okay, a long way to go. I'll speed up. Okay, so just briefly, so where does this leave a lot of these new graduates into the profession? They've a lot of the time they have little choice but to turn towards things such as unpaid internships in order to gain this experience that they're lacking. Interestingly, about 17% of the Italian archaeologists indicated that they first entered the workforce after they had done an unpaid internship, and that's quite a high percentage, I think. Now, although unpaid internships have a long history in several professions, in Ireland, I think the economic downturn has certainly seen a rise in this intern culture, as it's called, for new graduates. And this included the introduction in 2011 of a government scheme called JobBridge. And this is obviously in theory quite an important thing, which gives people about between 6 and 9 months experience. But it's also been quite controversial because it's supposed to be specifically for people in situations so that the intern that's brought in does not displace an existing employee, or that the person is recruited to actually fill a vacancy that could be otherwise advertised as a job. So, you know, there are obviously things to iron out in that sense. And furthermore, within the sort of recent Australian experience or exploitation questions, there's been concerns raised about whether or not these unpaid internships are excluding individuals from less well-off backgrounds from also gaining comparable experience. So again, it's issues about this sort of how do we create a more structured career path for these people. Okay, so quickly, so obviously something that we've been talking about a lot in the DISCO projects is vocational education and training, and really this is something that has kind of been lacking in most of our countries, perhaps bar the UK system, where since at least about 1999 they've seen significant sort of developments in this vocational training structures. And this idea of the sort of benchmarks and recommendations and so on. Whereas you can see in comparison in Ireland, really there's a huge sort of lack of awareness of VET training, and there is ultimately very little opportunities for people to undertake this kind of training within the archaeological profession. I will actually just skip over this. Basically, well, complementing Troika for once to do with bailouts and setting standards in terms of education and how that has led to some actually positive developments in further education and training, and how at the moment we perhaps are in a much stronger position to maybe push for archaeological vocational education training advances through these sort of new initiatives that have been coming in the last 2 years, and sort of maybe again more formalising that. So again, another aspect to the training is obviously CPD, or continuous professional development. And again, it seems that all the countries really are pretty much, supporting their employees and pushing them to continue with CPD. But of course, all talk and no action, I suppose, is something that comes to mind. And when we see whether or not they're actually keeping records of the impact of this training, and we see really things are just sort of falling by the wayside. Number one, a lot of companies across all the countries are not recording the impact that this additional training and education is having on their staff, and more importantly, even almost on their own organisations. And then also, people are not being offered incentives to continue to get additional training, additional education. So the responsibility is very much falling onto the individuals in many situations. Okay, so just then briefly, some of and this has been again talked about before, but some of these sort of skills gaps ideas, and again these often to be sort of gained through CPD sort of programs. When they were asked about staff training priorities, it's interesting that a lot of the countries actually gave the same sort of responses, specifically sort of practical skills, as I said, data archiving, and IT again is coming more and more, but again also things like project management and marketing and sales, so pushing again these ideas of maybe a more commercialized archaeology. Okay, very briefly, conclusions. So I suppose really where does all this data that we've been gathering for the DISCO project across Europe lead us? Very true. Well, we may be very highly educated with numerous transferable skills, but according to many of our employers, or most of our employers, that education is still not preparing us for the realities of employment in the archaeological workplace. In-job training, both formal and informal, remains very popular, as well as an increasing widespread of unpaid volunteers. But these could really be used to create measurable systems of learning that are carefully regulated and part of a structured career path, and I think that's really what we're sort of missing. Including, it could include the adoption of an internship system, but again, that needs to be really regulated. And in spite of the obvious connection, many countries are lacking a program of vocational training in archaeology, and I think given the EU's commitment to such training at the moment, especially, opportunities might exist for each of the countries to actually examine their own policies and determine how their existing programs, or lack thereof, might be adapted to improve the practical training of its workforce and feed into that establishing a national, if not, again, idealistically international system of standards. So while these individuals while the individuals are participating in continued professional development in many of these countries, and as we saw, it could be something even just going to a conference or attending a lecture, it seems that the employers themselves are failing to maintain records of this and really formally assessing the impact that this is having on their organisations and their employees. And without such feedback, it is very difficult to correctly develop these programs really, and to properly identify the real skills gaps that we have in the archaeological profession. So I think just finally, last sentence. In the face, I think, of the economic crisis, many organisations, as we heard, are diversifying and developing in order to basically ensure their survival in this very tough market time. So I think employers and individuals alike have that responsibility to ensure that they are ready to adapt to these new challenges. And perhaps by pooling and disseminating knowledge, something like we're doing with the DISCO project, expertise and experience can benefit the entire profession, and perhaps the archaeological sector will survive another day.
Thank you very much, Mary. That's a very useful contribution in a number of respects. Shows again the value of data mining, shows you, I think, the value of recording our practices in a variety of ways that's measurable. Probably time for one quick question, then we have something.
One short comment. I think one of the issues with continual professional development and formalized courses, at least for Austria, is that the market isn't big enough for any provider to step in with anything. So an international approach, particularly for small countries, would be crucial. Otherwise, we're never going to get it because there's not enough money. If you've got one person taking that up every year, that course will not run. It's as simple as that.
Thank you, very useful.
Well, we are a small country and we are successful in creating programs. We need to offer courses, new courses every 2 years because of the small group. So it's a dynamic thing.
Thank you. Can I ask the next speaker to come up? Karina is going to be with the afternoon now, and we'll be explaining into Romanian.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to present the results of this study, which I have to confess from the very beginning, I wanted very much to be undertaken in Romania. I'm in a way disappointed by the feedback, but in the same time I have to stress from the very beginning that these results, even preliminary, do come in a very significant moment in Romania, and I will explain you why. Basically, one of the answers is who is an archaeologist in Romania. And I have to say we have a very strict legal provision in saying who is allowed to perform archaeology in Romania. Basically, we have a national register administered by the Ministry of Culture, and only the archaeologists, either Romanian, either foreign, who are registered in there, can perform archaeology in Romania. Basically, if you are not in that register, you cannot perform archaeology in there. I would like very much to point out that we don't have any professional association of archaeologists existing in Romania, and in the same time there are too many legislative changes during the last 15 years, so we are trying to cope to a completely, either to say, uncoherent evolution, let's say, dictated in a way by the authorities, not by the professional bodies. Here you see the structure of this, let's say, profiling expertise. We have the beginner archaeologist, the special archaeologist, and the expert archaeologist. And as you will see, they are requested by the law to have a rather high academic education in order to be allowed to enter in a register. Basically, if you don't have a master's degree, you have no chance to be registered in this official database, who allows you to, that your name can be put officially on any type of archaeological, I dare to say, service. The number, how many archaeologists are in Romania? This national register offers us an amount of 858 people, but it's obviously this data have not been properly updated by the ministry. So, in fact, the number of persons currently working in archaeology is it's by far lower than this, and the estimate is that it is between 450 and 500 archaeologists. With in here you see the general profile of the employers in Romania, and I would like to point out in here that basically one cannot speak of private initiative in Romanian archaeology as long as there is more than 85%, as you can see, the monopoly of the public institutions, basically the state institutions, in this field. This is in a complete contradiction with the, I dare to say, natural evolution of the market, because in the last 15 years, the Romanian archaeology is dominated by contractual archaeology, by preventive archaeology, which this year reached up to the 80% of the archaeological excavations undertaken in Romania are preventive. And in terms of budgets, the state budget is somewhere between 2 to 3%. The rest, about 95%, is coming from private sources of financing. A very short introduction about the positions available, and I would like very much to point out to the idea that although required, once again, for the market, there are no positions for what is usual in other countries to have this archaeological management sector. Basically, you can be a researcher, you can also undertake a management task, but it's up to your own private individual skill to perform it, because there is absolutely no official recognition of this type of work. The consultants, yes, do exist, a very small number of firms, 5 in fact. Absolutely none answered to the individual questionnaire, despite the fact it was sent we sent it by post with paid response, incoming mail, and even to the phone calls they didn't want to respond. The only explanation for this situation is that as long we do under, let's say, the ministry, it's working to a new heritage code, and most probably they do believe it will be a moment in which they will liberalize the market. And as a result, it's better not to say something in this moment, but to expect to see what the future will bring. This is the only explanation I can, a reasonable explanation I found to this situation. The district questionnaire, the feedback. We've identified 93 archaeological employers, and the feedback, the consistent responses were coming from 25 of them, which it's almost 27% rate of responses, and for the individual one, especially given to the information required for the salaries, which is absolutely a very taboo subject in Romania, we decided to develop an online database managed, specially designed for the project, in which all the data were absolutely confidential, and only the person hired to be for the subcontracting part, the IP, was the one, let's say, seeing only the it's not nobody basically was required the name. Even so, it's obvious that it could have been better. We've promoted the questionnaire in many types of in many ways. Yet the ratio was also about around 25% of responses. In here you can see the ratio of relevance for the answers to the institutional questionnaire. And in here, it's a comparison between the public data we've been able to retrieve from the Register of Archaeologists in comparison to the data we've obtained throughout the institutional questionnaire in terms of the relevant, how much of this, let's say, archaeological market, archaeological employment, it's dominated by which type of entity. And once again, the data are showing very clearly that the museums are in Romania by far the leading category in terms of employers. About the employment dynamics, more or less, it is a very conservative, let's say, feeling about it. And one of the reasons is for sure the economic crisis. As long as we are speaking of 85% or even more of public institutions who hired archaeologists, and given the fact that since 2009 all of the Romanian government blocked the new employment in the public sector, correlated with a massive wave of retirement. This is the result. This is the main reason for this very conservative appreciation in regard to the employment dynamics. One critical issue, it is for sure related to the training need. We've developed a quite detailed part of the questionnaire in regard to training, and unfortunately the feedback, I would say this was the worst of it. Although it's once again a huge gap between what the universities are providing in terms of training to the young archaeologists and to what is really needed when they are working in the field. And I will moreover stress out, as I told you, about 80% of the excavations and the projects in Romanian archaeology are related to preventive archaeology. As you know, they are under time constraints, cost constraints, and site constraints, and we have simply to retrain all these young archaeologists, and in the same time, these projects are the only chance to be hired on a temporary basis. In terms of age and gender, you will see a massive prevalence of the male in Romanian archaeology, 62%. Yet with a slight tendency when we are looking to the numbers on the age categories, there is a very slight tendency that women will catch up, but it will quite take a while. The nationality, once again, I will want to point out that we are a rather conservative professional body, yet there are 15 foreign archaeologists, all from the countries of the European Union, who are registered in the register and are currently working in excavations. So basically, they are the international joint projects, Romanian and some other, and they are working in Romania. With a special remark that In some of the, and there is another source of information, we realized that it was too late for the project to retrieve properly all this data. We have a chronicle of archaeological excavations, which is published yearly by the Ministry of Culture. And just looking through the names in the archaeological teams, we realized there are by far some other foreign archaeologists working in Romania, which, in contradiction to the law, do not, they are not inscribed in this register. So still there are quite significant misunderstanding even how this law is applied. In terms of academic expertise, I will dare to say it's a quite high academic expertise required, as long as you have to bear in mind that only the expert archaeologists, only the one having a PhD, are allowed to conduct any type of archaeological excavation. And as you will see at the end, we are quite in a type of crisis, I guess to say, because less than 1/3 of the total number of active archaeologists do have this professional recognition on behalf of the ministry, and in fact all types of derogation are invented from a project to another just to allow the younger ones to come in leading these things. These are the data I told you. In here we were lucky enough to have two sources to compare. There are the data gathered from the individual questionnaire compared with the data provided by the Register of Archaeologists. More or less, it's important to point out that I dare to believe that the one obtained throughout the individual questionnaire are by far accurate. That's the one which can be displayed right now via this online database. The general expertise in terms of, let's say, the major periods of expertise, there is a high prevalence of prehistoric and protohistoric archaeology, followed by the classical archaeology, and less than 20% are specialized in medieval archaeology. For sure, we've asked also about some other type of expertise, but they were reluctant to answer. And in terms of employment, there is, according to the individual questionnaire, more than 70% are employed by these public institutions on permanent positions, and around 25% are on short-term contracts. Also, in regard to the type of employments, once again, the data obtained throughout the two questionnaires, it's confirming the data retrieved from the Register of Archaeologists that first there are the museums with more than 50%, and then the universities with around 25% in terms of hiring archaeologists in Romania. Once again, it's a comparative table about this, the ratio provided throughout the Register of Archaeology and the data provided by the individual questionnaire. And one of the second critical aspect of training needs were the answers in regard to the salaries. And you will see that the salaries are rather low in comparison to the high academic expertise required and to the type of work. I would like to make an a verbal comment, as long as it was impossible to state it in the national report. And I would like very much to have an advice on your behalf if an addendum will be accepted to this matter. As mentioned in our previous meetings, we do have a grey market for archaeology. Basically, the people who are working 10 hours per day, 6 days per week in these preventive archaeological large-scale excavations, they are paid, I would say, from grey money, because there is no labor contract. And I would like very much to have an advice on this issue, as long as it's not exactly the money the critical issue, but it's all the safety measures and some other, the social security, and even sometimes the equipment and the work conditions. Sometimes the work conditions in Romania means in summer about 45 Celsius degree full day, and you can reach in the, for instance, in November to work even in snow conditions. I would like very much if anybody can advise me a little bit how to treat this very sensitive issue. I will appreciate a lot. In terms of national affiliation in professional association, although we know that there is none, 7% declared of the people asking to the individual questionnaire declared that they are affiliated to a professional association in Romania, and there are it's a little bit better. The situation is about 20% of the archaeologists in Romania are registered, are members of the EAA. In conclusion, I dare to say that there are only preliminary data indicating the trends, but the data were gathered and publicly provided in a very critical moment in regard to this new legislative change and this high expectancy for opening the private market. The monopoly of the public institutions, I believe it's quite a major problem, and there is absolutely no positive answer or perspective for the future. A very critical aspect is the lack of formal training for practicing archaeology beside the university curricula, and as I told you, the huge gap between what people are taught in terms of archaeology in the universities and what is required in the practice. The blockage in terms of employment, and basically no chance, absolutely no chance to be a young archaeologist, even with a PhD, to be hired in the last 5 years, and we don't know what will be the future. This also a critical aspect in regard that less 1/3 of the registered archaeologists in Romania are allowed to, entitled according to the law, to lead all the types of excavations. The major discrepancy in terms of salaries, and for sure this very small number of professional associations, and in fact this problem which in a way the professional body instead of organizing themselves do prefer to wait for this very highly centralized state system we do have in Romania. I just thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karina. One quick comment as we're changing over. I'm proposing we use into a bit of the coffee break. I think it's important to have time to present in a way that's not pressured. And I'm sure we can coffee any time. We will get a short break first, actually. Sorry, Ray, you want to respond to ask the question?
One point I was wondering, I mean, you said that for directing a PhD. So what training do Romanian students get between finishing their masters and getting their PhD degree to manage an archaeological excavation?
The answer is absolutely not.
That's what I thought, because in Austria we have a similar situation between BA and MA, where the authorities request that to direct an excavation you have an MA, but there's absolutely no training provided in MA programs, and all field schools are in the BA program.
I can tell you from the very direct experience, they are completely shocked by the scale of the excavations and by the type of skills required on the field, only on the field, not to speak of the management of the project. A completely not addressed issue when they are faced for the first time. And still, none of the universities, although it's obvious this is the only chance to practice archaeology, are even thinking of changing a little bit their curriculum.
Thank you. I'd like to invite our next speaker, Lisa, to talk about the Italian insights.
So thank you first for letting us join this conference, and thank you for letting us join this project. Actually, we have to say that we are relating to our discussion that we had before in Italy in a pre-Malta situation. We are not beyond Malta. We are before Malta. So actually, the Italian participation to the second edition of this project has been for us the first occasion to analyze the archaeology sector in our country from the point of view of both workers and companies. So the collected data are helping us in profiling the profession for the first time, starting from education and training to the job perspective. We can say that the DISCO project gave us all the chance to face the many and different lacks of knowledge about archaeological work in Italy. Something that could be considered mainly as a result of three main elements. So first, the figure of the archaeologist as a freelance can still be considered as a recent thing in Italy today. Second, there is an extreme heterogeneous pattern and the 8 internal divisions among archaeology professionals. Last but not least, there's a lack of specific groups and laws defining archaeology as a profession, which is something that only 2 months ago started to change, thanks to the approval of the Law 110/2014 that finally states for the first time the presence of archaeologists in the Cultural Heritage Code of Law, which is something unusual for us. So the first question. I maybe do something like that. Okay. So, I'm sorry, I'll be moving. So actually, the first question constantly asked to us was the number of archaeologists working in Italy. So for the first time, we can answer that between November 2013 and March 2014, the month our data collection was done, we estimated a number of almost 4,500 working archaeologists in Italy, matching the certain number of archaeologists working for public organizations and DISCO survey percentages. So there's something more to be said in advance, anyway, to avoid the lack of national definition of who is an archaeologist in terms of titles and career. We followed Confederazione Italiana Archeology requirements, supplying only those awarded at least with a BA in archaeology or cultural heritage, with incomes partially or totally deriving from archaeological contracts in the past fiscal year. Seems that it doesn't work. Okay, this one? So to survey them, we designed 2 different questionnaires, one for the organizations and one for the single professionals, ready to be fulfilled on the Italian DISCO website. Even adopting these 2 apparently opposite glances on the context, we can say today the archaeological labor market in Italy is mainly a private sector one. So almost 66% of us work for private organizations or as freelancers, while in the public sector, only 400 are work for MIPAC, our Ministry of Cultural Heritage and Tourism, 371 for universities, and 86 for CNR, National Research Council. So it is a matter of fact that Italian archaeologists are used to collaborate with different organizations and companies at the same time, public and private as well, dealing not only with archaeology in particular, but with constructions or engineering works as well. Talking about professionals, we try to profile the typical Italian archaeologist, as it was recognizable thanks to the DISCO dataset. So we can profile an Italian woman of 37-year-old, mainly collaborating with public organizations as a freelance, working with a VAT number, holding contracts, or project basis contracts, rarely working as a long-term employee. She's mainly working on the field, on excavations, but can even work in offices, labs, libraries, and more rarely inside museums or archaeological areas. So she is generally overqualified. and badly wages. So she has an annual salary of 10,700 euros. Even though, together with BA, she was awarded of a post-laureate title as PhD, postdoc, or a specialization, all titles that in theory are offering accesses to top-level positions, both in private companies or public organizations. So let's have a deeper look at the data. In terms of gender, according to this survey, women make up the vast majority of the archaeological workforce. As almost the 71% of the DISCO respondents are women. We'll see together during this general overview if this can be considered as an index of gender equality or not. The suspect is that an appealing job market is the one with a good gender balance, while those where we mainly have women at work, at least in Italy, are those left and are considered pleasing by men in terms of earnings and in terms of social status. Average age is 37. By gender, average age for women is 36, while for men is 38. The abandoned man of the profession while turning 40, as you can see by the graph, is probably related to the lack of social protections and stability for freelancers in Italy, and not only, this is something that is not only related to the archaeological labor market. And anyway, it can be connected to the prevalence of field work among the archaeological activities in our country. So if we combine age and gender, it clearly shows as well that the distance between male and female archaeologists at work heavily reduces after turning 40. A clear sign of a higher professional abandonment of women getting closer to that age, today seen as a critical moment in case of lack of social protections deriving from a safe job. So, as already said, Italian archaeologists are well educated, highly educated. So, as you can see, only a small majority holds a first degree, while those awarded of a post-laureate qualification are the 52%. Among them, the 31% was awarded of a specialization, which actually is a 3-year degree necessary for entering the Ministry of Cultural Heritage as an officer or having a technical direction of excavations led by private companies, while more than the 15% has a PhD and 6% was awarded of a postdoc research fellowship. So it turns out archaeologists' main activities are excavations, and conservation and research in all its forms and shapes. So almost 1/4 of the respondents indicate the museum as their main place of work, in which they provide educational and visitor services to the public. So 4% they declare they left the job anyway for this moment. So it stands out immediately the wide variance between the number of people who stated they work for private archaeological organizations and the number of those, twice as much, who replied they mainly work on excavations, which is a typical activity of Italian private archaeological organizations. And the number of those, twice as much, that reflects that. So that's a very strong feature of Italian archaeological working force. 16% of workers without a contract as an employee state they have never worked for a private organization. This data represents the percentage of people, most of them provided with a VAT registration number, who usually work as a freelance archaeologist without an organization to directly refer to, which equals, say, almost to 700 people. So archaeological companies, anyway, and it's clear now, are ranking second among the employers, while from an economical point of view, they are the two principal employers. The comparison between 2012 and 2013 reveals that in the last year there has been a strong increase of archaeologists employed by universities and to a smaller extent by NIVAT. A slight increase has also been registered in the number of those employed by other Italian ministries, by private companies operating in the tourism sector, and by other kinds of organizations. So on the contrary, quite decisive is the decrease of archaeologists employed by local authorities, especially in local municipalities, and by archaeological companies as well. So the mentioned changes in employment happened in the space of 12 months. So this is very significant, thus indicating a marked downward trend. In 2013, contracts for steady jobs were at 30%. So 16% were long-term contracts, 14% fixed-term ones, so permanent ones. 43% of Italian archaeologists are freelancers anyway, often holding a VAT number. Anyway, between November 2013 and March 2014, the 28% of the respondents were unemployed. Among them, we have to include many professionals holding a VAT number as well. So the percentage of those declaring to be freelancers under a contract or not is almost 66%, which means 2/3 of the respondents. If we have a look at the earnings, well, the average annual turnover of full-time workers is of 16,000 euros, just a little bit higher than one of the year 2010 and 2018, with 15,000 euro earned. So the richer seems to be those working in university and National Ministry of Cultural Heritage, earning to 20,000 euro per year, while those working for more than one single employer, the real freelancers, earn few more than 14,000 euro per year. So the last paid ones are those working for archaeological companies, so that most of the Italian archaeologists, we can say, they are most of them, they're earning something more than 11,000 euro per year. So we can say that archaeology is not properly a remunerative job. For more than a quartile of the respondents, anyway, our job doesn't guarantee alone incomes good enough to reach economical independence. So the first quartile of archaeologists with lower annual earnings earn less than 6,000 euro and are more likely intending to leave the profession, while the wealthier quartile earns at least 22,000 euro per year. So there, in this quartile, in the last one, we find the only archaeologists with earnings in line with the national average ones that are around 9,000 euro per year. So the comparison between annual earnings and qualification anyway is disarming. So as clearly shown by this graph, a higher qualification is not directly connected to better position and higher earnings. Let's change the topic. So, talking about geographical distribution and headquarters, the bigger archaeological labor market is represented by the only city of Rome. So 20% of DISCO respondents are working there, while almost 27% of the archaeologists work in its region, Latin. So the higher number of universities with archaeology faculties, the presence of the Central Cultural Heritage Ministry offices, and most important, local law that mandatorily states the presence of an archaeologist following every single excavation done can give a good explanation for this factor. A factor that anyway will be changing if we divide Italy in 3 main macro regions. So there you will see that the center of the Italian peninsula sees almost 41% of the archaeologists at work, while the rest is almost equally distributed between the south, the center, the north, and the islands. But if we analyze the annual earnings by geographical distribution, we face a totally different scenario. In line with the national stats, archaeologists working in the northern Italian regions earn more than those working in the center and far more than those working in the south of Italy. This is in line with national stats as well. If we have a look at the organizations, those ruling the public archaeological market are the Italian Ministry of Culture, of Cultural Heritage, and universities. So, talking about universities, we will only be pointing out that they are, with no doubt in Italy, the main employers of archaeologists in 2013, together with the loss of 20% of archaeologists as long-term employees during the last 2 years. compared to the increasing number of archaeologists collaborating with them. Gender balance is a hot topic, we can say, as well. Referring to universities, so among researchers and postdoc fellowships, women are prevailing, while the situation starts changing as far as we reach the higher levels of the academic positions, where most of the full-time professors are men. And a similar dynamic is something that we can see if we have a look at MIPA data, so the data of our Ministry of Cultural Heritage and Tourism, where women presence goes down as far as we pass from the officers to the managers and general directors' roles. So, private archaeological companies. Private archaeological companies conducted for this research are 214. So those with a so-called OS25 license, actually, it is something requested to participate to public bids, are only 37 among the 307 different companies holding them in Italy. So this data clarifies two main issues within the peculiarity of the Italian archaeological labor market as mainly depending from the construction one, if we consider excavations and field activities. And on the other side, it clearly shows the weakness of it. If only 37 archaeological companies among 214 reach quality, economical, and structural standards, allowing them to compete with construction enterprises. Then, this pattern seems to be confirmed even if we look at the archaeological companies from the financial point of view. Half of the respondent companies declared earnings in 2013 of less than 50,000 euros. So only 3 of them earned more than 1 million euros in the same year. So, excavation, documentation, restoration works have traditionally been the main work fields for archaeological companies. Today, the only increasing one is that of the so-called new technologies, together with guided tours, teaching activities, and preventive archaeology. While talking about contracts offered by archaeological companies, project basis contracts are the 38%, followed by the national building sector contracts with 29% of responses, other national collective contracts, consultant contracts, and professional students contracts. So what can be connected to the economical crisis, and I'm getting closer to the end, is a new trend in hiring people. We can see that in 2013, the number of associates or owners of archaeological societies is increasing, something which is corresponding to a lower number of long-term contracts. And if we match the responses given by the professionals who collaborated with archaeological companies, it is clear that in 2013, new workers entered the market only in a minimal percentage. So these two data, together with the fact that 76% of the archaeological companies affirm that won't be hiring new workers at all in the next future, give us an immediate perception of the results of the economical crisis in terms of employment perspectives in the archaeological labor market. So furthermore, payments, timetables, both for companies and single professionals, see private and public commissioners paying not really soon, which means between 3 months and 1 year after the end of the works. So this lack of guarantees for times of payment seems to be one of the most impressive problems, talking about the stability of the archaeological labor market and the diffusion of a good employment conditions. So companies pointed out, together with that, high taxes, unfair competition among organizations, and a too deep connection between the archaeological labor market and the construction one as the major obstacles to companies' development. So actually, we can say that this project left us with a lot of questions and a lot of problems to be solved. We consider these results not really the end of the project, but actually the beginning of it, because now it's time for us to share them with politicians and policymakers. This is something that we'll be doing in the next future. So thank you for your attention and thank you for your help.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Do you mind if we save questions till after the break? I know everyone's been very patient tonight, we've overrun slightly. But coffee will be stopped very quickly. Those that do need coffee, go and get it now. We'll start back 5 minutes later. That's okay. But we've got lots to do that. We'll get this door open. Get a bit of air in. Yes. How do you do?
I want to be sure.
I'm not really sure because I had
I'm thinking about
You can do that in mid thing.
Wow.
How you doing? I'm alright, I'm alright. How are you? Oh, great.
But I just go by that. And so then I just do oh, I probably should. Maybe
This is the noise that's going to it's a pointer. If we can find just a few more, yeah. Neighbours of the Right, that's the Linnell extension.
Well, I've seen that. I've seen you do that. But even when we work with somebody,
Yeah, I can't actually
to
get
enter a house.
Yeah.
I worry. I need to be sort of that. Oh, I knew.
You give them a load of yeah, remember any imagery?
No, I never had to work,
Okay, everybody. Welcome back, and welcome to those who are newly joining us for the final session of Discovering the Archaeologists. We'll have a time for discussion, which I look forward to, but I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our next speaker, Harry, who will give us some further information about very exciting development in the Americas.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everyone, and I do have to apologize at the outset that I have no exciting graphics, no funny pictures, so you'll have to, this is a test to see if you can make it through the last, few papers of the afternoon. And I'll explain a little bit more why that's the case as I go on. Primarily, I wanted to talk about this Discovering the Archaeologists of the Americas initiative, which was developed following on from DISCO, or DAE as we sometimes call it in America because we're different with acronyms. And the Society for American Archaeology, or the SAA, took inspiration from DISCO and tried to push it to all the stakeholders in America. And so this is an update on where we are, which is kind of exciting. And over the years, really starting in earnest, I would say probably in the early 1990s, people would undertake topical studies, small studies, and there were books and some articles, but it's unclear why no major efforts were undertaken. Well, it's really not unclear because it's a massive job. And we finally came to terms with the fact that archaeological employment and education information is not available on a consistent or comparable basis across all the countries of the Americas, which, without going into a great amount of detail, they're represented by large land masses, distance, many languages, not unlike the issues you have in Europe. And why would we do this in the Americas? And these are the reasons we came up with to convince people why it was important. So these are very similar to the reasons you've done it in Europe, to gather information basically about employment and qualifications, and broader issues such as what does it mean that archaeologists working in one country and another, or even in one state in another, in the United States. And ultimately, we'd like to collect, analyze, interpret, and share this information across the countries of the Americas in order to understand
the needs and current state of employment for the profession. And you are all so much farther along. I've been attending the disco sessions for a number of years now, and you really should congratulate yourselves on how far you've come in the process. And we also wanted to set up a procedure and a rationale for periodically examining trends and repeating the survey to obtain longitudinal information. So we will generate a profile of the workforce, and in many areas of the America, highlighting diversity issues and gender issues are important just as they are here. But sometimes it's very sensitive how we ask those questions. We also wanted to gather and interpret details of the nature and extent of the profession, including accurate employment figures in different countries and sectors. And just from the talks this afternoon, it's been clear that some countries, the employment is concentrated in the public sector and without any consultancies, and in other countries it's quite different. So we'd like to disseminate the results of this work and informing the archaeological profession as we're doing here, but others, including political decision makers, at the outcomes of this research. And I was excited to hear that many of you are also seeing the usefulness of these data for political advocacy, and at least political education, I shouldn't say. And doing these things will support measuring capacity and planning for future development. We recently did a survey of the American Cultural Resources Association to ask what were the biggest challenges for heritage management in the next decade. And almost every owner of a company said that adequately trained individuals. And so we're having our annual meeting directly following on this, and we're going to be at a session that combines educators with heritage professionals, and I think it would be really interesting to see when we're not just pointing the finger at one another, and say, how can we help each other? And I'm looking forward to that. We'd also like to identify patterns in practice. Where are people working? And how can we support them better? How can the organizations that they belong to help them? And then identifying the potential economic impact of archaeological work in different contexts. And last year I reported to you on a survey that AFRA conducted. It was a demand-side survey that came up with a number of 1,300 firms in the United States employing 10,000 heritage professionals, not all archaeologists, but predominantly archaeologists, and a combined revenue of $1 billion a year. So that was we had a very high level of, and actually one of my colleagues worked on it here, Michael back there, and it was, and we used those data to impress lawmakers that, with taxpayers, we might vote for them in their districts, and, it's getting a lot of awareness. So, we wanted to do this comprehensive project, so we can look quickly at these desired outcomes. They're not unlike the outcomes you're wishing for DISCO. And again, we highlight the identification of needs for training and continuing education training that we hear every year when we have DISCO papers that people are continuing to struggle with this. And we'd like to really create summary statements describing the profile and diversity so that we understand and can help each other better. More of them, creation of benchmarks, accumulating quantifiable data, especially for political advocacy, tying it with economic impacts, and then potential for future repetition will also be important. And I'm heartened to see sort of the effects that you're seeing now with some of this following work. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how GAA came about. And so the scope is huge, 34 countries, 21 dependent areas in North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean. Getting the stakeholders on board was a big deal. And I wanted to point out the role of one man focusing the initiative, Jeff Altschul back there, and the contributions of professional organizations in the U.S. So a number of years ago, Jeff started talking to all the boards and the directors of these different professional societies and said, we need to get on board with this. And why don't you send Terry to the COG meeting? Why don't you contribute some money and send her along? And that was the meeting where the second component of DISCO was getting underway. And I had no idea what I was getting into, but everyone was very gracious to me. And so I went as an observer. And when I came back, we talked a little bit about getting these professional societies to pay for something like DISCO, but realized, well, DISCO was quite expensive. And it would be difficult, if this was going to be self-funded by, it would be very difficult to do. So Jeff really urged the SAA to take the lead and seize the moment. And really, it's not the fault of the other societies, but they have very limited budgets based on membership, meeting revenues, and things like that. So it's not pointing the finger, it's just a reality. So SAA took the lead, and it's become a focus of Jeff's presidency, and we have to thank them in the U.S. for really pushing it. So their board created a task force to study the issue for the Americas and make recommendations. And the first task force, which recently completed its work late last year, recommended a pilot project so we could figure out the methods that would work in a comprehensive project. And to do that, we would do a pilot study in one state in the United States and one country in South America, because they're likely to be very, very different. And we would structure it to be comparable with the results of the DISCO project, and it would be based on market research, LMI, labor market intelligence, from a demand side perspective. And this is not immediately accepted, and usually it may not yet be fully accepted. So there's pros and cons because of, and I've seen that some of them do a combination approach, and that's really not the focus here. So as with DISCO, the pilot project, we collect LMI in the 11 core areas that you're all familiar with, and you've all modified slightly. Kenneth, is that correct? It's it. And so we did a little tweaking, but it's basically numbers of people, age and gender, employment data, people working 1, 3, 5 years ago, and can we expect more people working in archaeology in the future? The highest qualification of degrees. Now this is the hardest thing, because the question of who is an archaeologist is very different in different areas, as we know. The training needs and skill shortages, salaries or wages, the kinds of contracts, and the data about the types of organizations operating in archaeology in country by activity and organizational basis. So the SAA board approved of the recommendations that was submitted last September, and a newly created task force was made to create a request for proposals, and that's what we basically call a request for a tender or bid. And we have, the task force that I chaired just completed the draft RFP. It's been submitted to the board, and they will be discussing improving it. And it will be sent to market research firms to obtain competitive proposals and bids. And the SAA is, the RFP is designed that the SAA will provide support to the successful bidder to try to bring the cost down. And so we're hoping to have reasonable costs and focus on information gathering in a very short time frame. And I think this is the way that we'll be able to engage, get later buy-in to the project, that it isn't a massive thing, because we may have to phase it. And we're asking for preliminary results by spring 2015. And we'd like to use the info from the pilot study to write proposals to convince funders that the full project should be supported. And it almost certainly will be phased. Sitting here thinking about this a lot, like I have over the last several weeks, I feel that the biggest challenges are keeping and building the momentum. And the success of the pilot project is imperative, and the fact that it's something that's financially feasible is important. And convincing stakeholders that it's important is not as easy as it might think. So when I first went to the disco meeting in Prague, people seemed on board, but some people were more tentative, not because they personally felt it was a bad idea, but because they thought in their countries it would be a hard sell, it would be difficult. And I had an interesting conversation. I knew a man that now works, he's in a high archaeological position in Argentina. I ran into him at our annual meeting last spring, and part of this is selling, right? So you talk about it, you say how wonderful it is, and talk about disco and all that. So I brought it up with him, and he goes, well, my colleagues will just think of this as another capitalist enterprise of the United States. I'm like, oh, so how do we, why are you collecting our data? So, I mean, and he's a friend of mine. So that was scary. I thought, well, what if someone who isn't a friend, how will they react to this? But when we need to obtain adequate and appropriate funding, what I mean by that is I worked on projects that have taken me 5 years because I had to, hoard my pennies, so to speak. I had to do a small grant here, a small grant there, and I spent all of my time administering and not working on the project. And I think we need to get appropriate funding that allows people to do the work and not constantly do fundraising. And so, like I said, we've got to convince the remaining countries in the Americas that the motives for the initiative are non-threatening. And we actually found some people in the U.S. that were interested in it, and then they say, well, I'm not interested now because I have other issues. So you have to be a cheerleader, and really, I mean, Kenneth started out as a cheerleader, and now pretty much the rest of you are, at some level, proponents of this. So that's what we're hoping to create. And just to conclude, I really feel that a successful American project like this will contribute to our global knowledge of archaeological demographics and practice, and it will only help us see our commonalities as well as the differences, but it will strengthen us as colleagues. And I'd like to thank Disco for inspiring us, and the EAA for providing venues to continue our mutual discussions. And I have to tell you, you've been very appreciative of me and the rest of my American and non-European colleagues, and that means a lot to us because I think we've become better archaeologists. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry. Again, a really important reminder about the utility of these data sets and being clear about the value proposition. Why do the end users need this? Do we have any other points or questions, Terry?
No questions?
Okay, we look forward to hearing more.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I'd like to invite our next speaker up. Edward will be telling us about the results in Slovakia.
I didn't mess that up.
Dear friends, I would like to present some most interesting results from our project we made with Danica Stashiko asking over there. So, at first, who is an archaeologist in Slovakia? There's no definition by law, but there is something like a common sense that archaeologists, it's common sense among archaeologists. Archaeologist is a person or a person may work as an archaeologist in Slovakia if he or she completed a university degree at least to a master degree level. Bachelors do not work in Slovak archaeology as scientists, but they can be employed as technicians or to carry out archaeological activities at regional museums. It's because the Slovak archaeological community is a little bit conservative. Because all of the order have a master degree, but now the situation is changed, but the younger has only bachelor's, and so they want to have also the master degree. So, present-day field archaeological research is done mostly as rescue excavations, since there are almost no financial resources for scientific archaeological researches, like in Czech Republic and Slovenia and so on. For practicing field archaeological research, the archaeologists need to obtain a certificate of professional competence on the basis of an authorization issued by the Ministry of Culture for a 5-year period, the so-called license. Now to institutions. Archaeology in Slovakia covers several types of institutions, activities of which differ. According to their activities and orientation, these organizations can be divided into 5 basic categories, that is museums, universities, Slovak Academy of Sciences, cultural heritage protection, private companies, and total so. The questionnaire was originally sent to 58 archaeological institutions. There are total 74 institutions known from the internet that employ archaeologists. They returned 36 field questionnaires relating to 52 offices. Yes. The success of the questionnaire by the number of sent and filled in questionnaires expressed as a percentage of 70. 22 institutions didn't fill the questionnaires. Now, about the institutions. As you can see, most archaeologists are employed in the Archaeological Institute of Slovak Academy of Science. That is 74, which is 33%. About half of all archaeologists, 121, which is 54%, do not have the so-called license. It is because young archaeologists can obtain a license after 3 years of field work under a supervisor with license. Other persons not involved in excavations do not need a license. The data from 2013 were compared to those obtained in the previous DISCO project. There are increased number of there are increased numbers of organizations and archaeologists too. The biggest change occurred in the number of private organizations. They have increased dramatically from the number of initially 3 institutions to 13. They increased by more than 300%. The number of institutions engaged in cultural heritage preservation has increased by 25%. According to our results, and in comparison with the year 2007, the number of museums that employ archaeologists decreased by 1. This result, for being a small diminution, cannot be regarded as a positive one because it shows a trend of stagnation in employment of archaeologists at museums. It happens despite the fact that majority of museums in Slovakia have archaeological collections. There aren't archaeologists employed in many of them, or their number is not sufficient. The future expectations. The majority of 36 institutions, 63 on average, is expecting the same situation again. Only half of them, however, have this assumption as far as the year 2016 is concerned. 70% of employers suppose an increase in the employment of archaeologists in the next 3 years, which sounds slightly optimistic. 3% of the institutions assume a decrease. The number of don't know responses has slightly increased, which is understandable given the uncertainty in planning for a longer period of time. The decline in the number of archaeologists is not planned, which is pleasing. So regarding the number of graduates, which are 20 or 30 a year, we assume that most of them will not be working in archaeology as long as they would not found a private company, which is quite easy in Slovakia. We have many one-man private organizations, and then they employed for a time subcontractors for a month or 3 months and so on. About gender, men archaeologists are prevailing over women. As you see, the mutual ratio of female and male archaeologists is 60% to 40%. This ratio, however, will be probably changed since more women than men are currently studying archaeology. As I see, it is a current trend in European archaeology. Now, the number of women are increasing. The average age of men archaeologists is 53, is higher than that of women, which is 39. As far as the age is concerned, the 40 to 49 age group is the most numerous. No. Most persons over 60 years of age are working at universities and in the Archaeological Institute of Slovak Academy of Sciences. The youngest age category among the archaeologists is a person at the age of 20 to 29. In this age group, women are predominating significantly, which could indicate the development leading to the balanced ratio between men and women in the archaeological profession. This phenomenon is also proved by the number of graduates of archaeology. I made a small research, and in the period of 1950 to 2012, 46% of women finished their archaeological studies at the Communist University. In the past decade, however, the ratio of men and women has changed. Archaeology has been studied by 47% of men, so it's opposite. Now, when comparing the data on the numbers of men and women in archaeology, it goes from 2007, the situation concerning the ratio of male and female archaeologists has not changed until now. So, to conclude, the global economic crisis had no effect on the number of employed archaeologists. There are no money, but this is another question. On the contrary, the number has increased when compared to the previous fiscal project. It's because the number of private archaeological companies is on rise, as I said. The reason for this increase is relatively simple. After finishing their studies, young graduates are seeking their first job. The problem is that there are very few new jobs positions in archaeology, especially in state institutions, which are the biggest employers in archaeology. Therefore, the fresh graduates are forced to start their own biggest employer, their own business in archaeology. As I said, it's very easy. In state institutions, the number of employees is still more or less the same. And the ratio of men and women, as I said, is almost equal, with a very slight predominance of men. However, the overall trend suggests that in the future there will be a higher ratio of female archaeologists. And in the end, as well as in the previous project, we must state that archaeology in Slovakia is seriously underfinanced. State institutions are the most visible example. The archaeologists are underpaid and there are limited possibilities of cooperation with other institutions. Field excavations, exhibition activities, and particularly the research, publication and translation of scientific results would require considerable higher funding. So the situation seems to be tragic, but it will be what future brings. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Again, some of those trends that we're seeing elsewhere, developers, privatisation, and a question already been raised.
Yeah. Since we're very close to Austria, and we have an increase in private companies, did any of them say, or did you try to find out whether they were working across the border as well, or whether they were all operating in Slovakia?
Only in Slovakia, but we have some individuals working in Austria.
Yeah.
About 5.
Yeah, but no company.
No company. No company.
Thank you.
Paul?
You have a table of pessimism and optimism in terms of future employment, and I just wondered if you knew whether the private sector was more optimistic and the public sector was more pessimistic, whether the figures broke down that way or not.
I
couldn't say.
I couldn't say. No.
Any further questions or points? Okay, many thanks, Edward. So our final speaker of today, the one and only Kenneth Aitchison, will take a broader perspective, I think.
Yeah, maybe. The problem with, no, 2 problems with this paper. One is that every single thing that I've seen already today has made me want to change things in the paper, and so I've just made a couple of little alterations at the last minute. So just excuse while I copy it over from my data stick. I've got to say, just thinking about general trends, it is interesting that some countries are reporting growth over the last 5 years, since last disco, growth in the total numbers of people, and some countries are reporting a drop. It looks like, in many cases, it's been the places where there were more people 5 years ago, like the United Kingdom, that have suffered the biggest drops, and other places, like for example Slovakia, are able to actually growing in this last little period. So I don't know, is there a bigger they are, the harder they fall kind of metaphor there somewhere? Okay. Just. Okay. All right, well, we got there quite quick. Right, there's the introduction. Oh no, there's a moustache coming, and you've all seen it already. Okay, start off. Here's my paper. Here's my paper with its rather elaborate title. I thought I was perhaps being clever when I wrote this title, and when I wrote the abstract. And I thought, yeah, I can say all sorts of things, and there'll be all sorts of different things that will come out of everything that's happened, and everything I will have read in the 6 months since I wrote the abstract. So it's interesting that I was imagining historiographies of empire. I was imagining that Disco would show us that there were continuities between archaeology and archaeological practice in different countries, and it doesn't need to be empire like the British Empire, although there, of course, is Mortimer Wheeler, the excavator of Maiden Castle, who was also Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. And then this paper isn't about that. This paper is a little bit about cultural continuity and national traditions, which we discussed in the break just before lunch. But it's not really about that. Although, interestingly, there's Wheeler with, that's probably Mohenjo-daro in the background. There's maybe continuity of field technique, not continuity, history of field technique is a different yet interesting subject. The beautiful slide that Michaela showed us of excavation in Czech Republic with fantastic, perfect squares, perfectly excavated clean grid pattern. He could have done that. Anyway. So, to move on to what this is really about. Why are we talking about this? Why is archaeological practice, and I I won't apologize for focusing quite a lot on applied archaeological practice. Why does this matter? Why is it important? And why is this whole discovering process important? How does it fit in there? Why is that important? That now to me is important because it's very near where I live, but that's a problem. And what has all of this, what has something like that got to do with global or European archaeology? Now, just in an anecdotal way, there is a medieval ship being excavated under the one particular aspect of the UK's various system for delivering development-led archaeology, and it's in a tiny archaeological way. The Newport ship is, of course, important for European archaeology because it's a Portuguese ship, and there are various tiny little connections, as Sedelia was about to say. It's the idea of things like connections in archaeology and connections in material culture is one thing, and that is interesting. But actually, what we've learned today is that that really has almost nothing to do with archaeological practice, and there is no European archaeological practice. There are national practices. That's one of the big lessons that has come out of 21 national reports, that we have seen that things are just different, and that things have been structured, and they have not, almost inevitably, they have not been structured by archaeologists or archaeological practice, but they're structured by greater social changes and issues. So, yes, there we go. We're into thinking about it being about traditions of practice. There have been different ways of doing things. Now, we can begin to say that across our 21 countries, there are some places where there is the tradition of practice. Now, the dominant tradition of practice is a commercialized model. And there is others where it is a academic or statist model. And I don't, again, apologize for lumping those two together. There's the grand top-down declarations from on high of how important the archaeology of this land is. It's just, of course, by chance that this is a picture of France while I'm saying this. It's that there are different ways to do things, and that these have been adopted. And I'm not saying that they're necessarily universally accepted, but that they are adopted and delivered in different countries based on, I think, traditions that have a lot more to do with the way things are done in that country than anything to do with archaeology. At root, when it comes into archaeology, I think a lot then depends on whether you think of archaeology as being a cultural activity or an environmental activity. If it's cultural, it is about the beautiful objects, the beautiful things, the beautiful past, Portugal's wonderful history, Scotland's wonderful history, all of these kind of things. When it's environmental, it is actually easier to understand on a bigger than a national level. If you think of in terms of the historic environment and of an environmental resource, that is, environmental resources are easier to see in a supranational way. So, I think there have been two significant factors that have structured everything. Okay, we spoke just before lunch, we spoke a little bit about big social changes, about democracy in 1989 and Thatcher and things like that. I think the big issues have been the Valletta Convention and how it has been adopted in different countries. Now, interesting that of our 14 papers today, I recorded 4 of them making reference to the Valletta Convention, and the rest. But then maybe it's not overtly referred to because it's just an understood thing that is out there, that is understood and that has been adopted into national practice. But it's interesting that it has been adopted into national practice in a way that suits those national traditions, stereotypes that I was talking about earlier. And of course, the other big factor has been the thing that has come into every presentation, actually, and the thing that is almost underpinning DISCO, because this is about the European Commission's New Skills for New Jobs initiative, which is about post-economic collapse recovery. When we did that, that's the cover of publication from a session at EAA 2009 in Riva del Garda. Then we were talking about a crisis, and it was a crisis that came out of nowhere, out of America in 2008, and suddenly whoosh. Some countries have gone through that, and some countries have gone into that, and then into sovereign debt crisis, and then into Eurozone crises. Some countries, there is not just one crisis affecting archaeology, there is ongoing economic differences, and as we have learned, different countries are being in archaeology. Well, it's not just archaeology that's being affected, is it? There is no country where the crises are only affecting archaeology and not wider society. And there is nowhere where it is the way that we do archaeology that is to blame for the crisis or how it has affected archaeology. But this is the other big thing that has been affecting everything we're talking about. I mean, for example, to start throwing in some statistics and graphs there, there's a nice, lovely, beautiful crisis-related graph to show the number of excavations in Ireland dropping away so heavily from the peak. Now that's interesting because the peak is actually 2002-3, and that's the end of gigantic motorway highway building programs that then also coincides with the end of lots of European Union funding, Objective 1 money ending when Ireland is technically no longer a poor country, and then the crisis, the crash. And just how Irish archaeology has changed in that way. There's another one, a graph that you've already seen in very slightly different form, the graph of the number of people being paid to be archaeologists in the UK, and that rising and rising and rising. And as Doug was mentioning earlier, well, you didn't quite mention that the 2007-2008 survey, the pre-Disco one, the week we asked for responses, we asked, there was a specific survey date, tell us how many people worked for you on this day. That was exactly the week that some people in the United Kingdom remembered that Northern Rock collapsed. It was the first banking collapse in the UK of the crisis. So actually, we collected data at the very top of the top. And then the 2012-13 data, which Doug did mention, we think we actually collected data there at the very bottom of the bottom. So this is, we've seen in the UK, that is exactly the range of the effects of the economic, that forever and ongoing, but the immediate effects of the economic crisis. So, still thinking about why all of these data, why doing things like DISCO are important. It is, in one way, it is good to be collecting things like information about how many people work and what they do and what skills they need. I think this is important when we think of archaeological practice in the model of environmental economics, about the way that the environment can be valued, the way that environmental resources can be valued and they can be protected essentially on a financial model. Some things, let's think about archaeology, some monuments are so precious they can't be damaged in any way. They are priceless. Or are they? Because it is possible in England to get scheduled ancient monument consent to dig holes in the middle of Stonehenge, as Tim Darville and Jeff Wainwright would confirm. It's the, essentially, there is always a way that the damage to archaeological monuments or other resources or other environmental resources can be mitigated, and sometimes that is being mitigated by, for example, in most archaeology, by the polluter having to pay for the appropriate recording and recovery of the archaeological data. This information is, a quick environmental economics graph, right. Confusingly, all the countries of the 21 in the project, amounts of money. These are, okay, we know the number of people working in each of the 21 participating countries. We know the average salary in each country. Okay, multiply them together, there is the total wage bill. If we take wages as being 60% of the actual cost or investment in archaeology, and so I've done that multiplication, we've taken salaries and wages as being 60% and then bumped that up appropriately. There we see UK and Germany, there, that's 250 million euro, on the basis of the idea of that being an annual investment in archaeology in these 21 countries. And in total, that produces an aggregate figure there, very long aggregate figure, but that is just over €1 billion per year, things I consider being spent on archaeology in these 21 countries. And there's different ways the word billion can be applied. I'm using it in the sense of 1,000 million. Okay. 3 commas, or 3 dots. So I think in the 21 countries participating in Discovering Archaeology Europe 2012-14, I think we can say that this is representing investment expenditure of €1 billion per year. That's the kind. I'm just so pleased that that number came out just outside of 1 billion, because it makes it all the better when we present things to politicians. And of course, we also have to remember that doing the archaeological work, as well as having economic value, and forgive me for liking the economic value best, it does have cultural and social value. Actually, the material that comes out, transforming the dirt into data, into information, into knowledge, does have cultural and social value. And it does have academic value, of course. All of these pieces of information are useful for teaching people about archaeological practice. I use that particular slide because it always used to lurk on the University of York's archaeology webpage, without any credit from the University of York. But it's just just to show that these things are useful. It's about how many investigations there are every year in, I think that's in England, and how many of them are led economically by the development process. Those economics, culture, social, and educational are 3 aspects of why this information is important. But I think then the most important way that it can be used is as a tool to measure capacity. And measuring capacity, as in the ways that is set out in the best writings about capacity building, measuring capacity is part of the capacity building cycle. First you measure capacity. You see what you, the organization, the country, the whatever, what you've got. Then once you've measured, then you can think about how to plan to improve. You prepare a plan for improving capacity, you do the plan, then you measure again to see if you have improved. It is the most basic tool in that cycle. I think that is where these information are most useful for. And I'm so pleased that we had 1 or 2 mentions of building capacity during the presentations earlier. And so where else has stuff like this? Now, at last I'm getting onto the global bit. So where else has this kind of information already been thought about? We've seen it being done in 21 countries in Europe, plus of course we had previous DISCO, which also got information from Hungary and 2 parts of Belgium that are not part of this project. Australia. In Australia, there have been a good series of very similar surveys which quite openly credit all this initiative and previous profiling the profession surveys as being the inspiration that Sean Allen has led. I think Australia has now collected data 3 times, and this has been, again, at about 5-year intervals, and it's been very useful to look at Australian archaeology, as Australian archaeology had a different experience of the global economic crisis than European did, because Australian archaeology is mostly about doing rural survey work ahead of minerals extraction. Right, I say mostly, but that's where the money is. Because the minerals extraction continues in China, continued in Australia, because China wanted this work to be carrying on. And so Australian archaeology was able to show that it was coping with the global economic crisis in a way that other places weren't. In Japan, there's been a good tradition, a good history of gathering very valuable data. As you see that graph, the top line is total investment in archaeology on an annual basis. And then the second line is total investment in archaeology from private sources, and at the bottom from public sources. And Japanese archaeology, indeed, Japanese society, hitting an economic switch in about 2006, and just the end of not quite the end of speculative construction, but the end of an awful lot of development-led work, changed the nature of archaeology. This is a graph of how much is being spent on investigations. Japanese archaeology didn't actually lose as many people as some of the European countries that have been affected by economic change. But Japanese archaeology transformed largely in the kind of service that was being provided, focusing more on a kind of public-orientated service. And so it coped better. It led to some different problems in Japanese archaeology. Jobs froze, no one left, no one new could come in, no one dared to try to go to a different place. But there were still jobs. But it made for a very different economic labour market related crisis situation. We've just been hearing a tiny little bit about the things in the United States. Here's a couple of acrographs thinking about these kind of graphs showing, in this first case, what cultural resource management businesses were experiencing. A positive number means there's a net more say things are good than things are bad. This, yeah, it's a little bit out of date now, it goes up to 2011, but it shows the level of general low-level misery at the time, but business confidence, boost, boost, boost. So there is interesting things to be learned from carrying out research into things like business attitudes as well as just into numbers. When we think back to the presentation we had this morning from Felipe, what Felipe and Eva had done about looking at businesses and the way that businesses function, thinking about confidence and innovation, was, I thought, very interesting. I mean, that reminds me about everything that we've heard today, about the nature of all the reports we've had, while we've had lots of good, solid data. And it was good to have Helene's presentation at the start to compare the core data across the piece. The kind of information that we were then getting was the additional data that different countries wanted to collect, the additional picture, the colour, the things that really made the story of Italian archaeology particular and different. It really made us aware of just the way that things were happening differently in Portugal, very differently in Portugal. And so it's been great that we've been collecting all of this and that we've been able to collect these extra bits of information, not just the utter bare bones. And that's why I'm thinking about information like that fitting in nicely. Thank you, Terry. Right, Terry's paper, that's it. The whole idea that there is a Discovering Archaeologists of America initiative idea out there. So I don't need to say any more about that. Good, thank you, that saved me a minute or two. And then to continue around the world, think about archaeology in Africa. Archaeology in Africa is different again. They're before the days of Arab Spring, between Republic of South Africa and Egypt, where in both those countries there were quite large numbers of people, relatively large numbers of people working as archaeologists. Between them, all the rest of Africa, there were so few professional archaeologists. Those photos are from Chad Cameroon Pipeline, which is, what date stand at, 2003. So that was more than 10 years ago. Enormously long pipeline project, 1,600 kilometers going from the edge of the desert across the mountains through the forests down to the sea. And when it started, I think there was one professional archaeologist in Chad, 3 in Cameroon, and they were having to manage such a project. And so it shows that particular example shows a little insight into the way that things sometimes have to be done in Africa, where big infrastructure projects will have funding from bodies very much like World Bank, Africa Development Bank, and it is there that there will be an insistence that capacity building is built into the projects. And so there's extra value of finding ways to find out what has Africa already got, what have the African countries got, what do they need, how can we build. Back to the very first mentioned word empire at the start. The systems of archaeological heritage management in Francophone West Africa look an awful lot like the French system. And this has been interesting that there has been, again, that way there has been a little bit of, it doesn't necessarily mean it's been a cultural continuity from days of empire, but it does mean that there is a shared understanding of what they consider to be the best ways of doing things. So that there is some, around the world, there are some hints of cultural continuity. Empire is a bad concept, but the idea that we can actually identify commonalities of practice is, I think, quite interesting. And so with that, I come to the end, and I come to conclude, and I come back to thinking, I'm so glad that this project has got off the ground. I'm so glad that so many people, so many organizations have been involved. I'm so glad that there's so many people in this room, and doubly glad that many of you are not actually in the project. I'm so glad that we've been talking about this at other EAAs throughout the past few years, the ways that we've been planning this, the way we did the previous project. I see enormous value in the work we have done. I see enormous value in the international, transnational cooperation and team building that we have managed to do through doing a project like this. I value the contacts that we have all made and the potential that we have for future cooperation and future projects. Of course, which I really hope might involve another similar project, maybe similar, maybe not exactly the same, but similar project. Because again, we have seen so much value, not just in the snapshots of data, but when we have had trend data, when we've been able to compare now to 5 years ago to 5 years before. I think the value of trying to collect that so that we don't just have dots on the map, we start to have lines. I think this is going to be a valuable and useful future for the Discovering Archaeologists of Europe, and, as we've already been talking about, I hope, for other comparable projects elsewhere in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kenny. Always good to get the broader perspective, and you're absolutely right. The connections, the opportunities to learn is one of the reasons why we're all in this room, and I think we already benefit from that. I'm sure after today, right, this first of all, is that there are probably lots and lots of questions, and lots and lots of areas of discussion, and just to open it up straight away. Is there anything you want to ask Kenny in particular? No, sure. Everything might be in now, is that? Well, before we go through more broadly, I'm just going to quickly for Lisa, because I enjoyed your presentation and you didn't get a chance to take questions after. I thought it was very striking you were saying about the north-south balance in Italy. Presumably in southern Italy there is no lack of heritage assets, archaeological sites. So again, I suppose it resonates with what Kenny is saying is, and others, that this is about other cultural and social conditions, not simply about our archaeological practices. How are you going to engage with these imbalances? Can we?
Well, actually, we have no time to explain that anyway. This is in line with the pattern, the business pattern, the general business pattern. So it's forward like that, historical thinking. Since Italy became a united country, we have to face this situation, not only in archaeology, in all businesses. So salaries there are lower. Business does not so well as in northern side. I mean, it's something about the shift in the history of our industrialization process and so on. We have to know that Italy will always have a problem, the so-called problem of the southern area of Italy with express measures to overcome that. That you can see don't work so much. So archaeology in that case simply reflects and is in line with the general trend.
I believe they have probably accelerated the growth. That's how other leaders concentrated on focus Thailand and others. So it's not the only because we are in the construction sector, and when you in the construction sector, obviously there are no other corporation that control the corporation. So this is one of the reasons. There are less work jobs in the and the jobs normally are only in museums, in the research, not always in the quality of oil.
Actually, no private investors want to invest their money in a place where they would be critical to reach a goal and to work without receiving some specific or question on doing or not doing. As you can see, actually, things that an Italian archaeological business word doesn't exist. It's really, really weak, and it's weak there as well. I would never invest my money if I were a program or in the south. I'm sorry, it's terrible for me to say that, but now there are no conditions at all.
Thank you. That's a very useful insight. I think we'd like to have Frank and Kenny back up as the co-organisers and broaden the discussion. Thank you for your insights on this today.
Well, to broaden it up right away, Kenny, what would a European archaeology look like if it's not national archaeology? If you close your eyes, it's
Okay, I'm closing my eyes, closing my mind. I close my mind to this idea. I'm closing my eyes, and I'm going into a little bit of telepathic communication with David at the back of the room to think about what a European archaeology might be like. A nice European archaeology where a good substantially sized company can work with ease without obstacles in other European countries. There was a time when that was a lovely idea, and my slide from the site of Canal Seine North Europe, it was well, it wasn't a picture of Oxford working on it. It was a picture of INRAP working on that project. But there was a time, a brief time, when that most simple of things seemed to be able to happen, and then that was essentially stopped by the norms of the state in which that was happening. There are, of course, we know that there is on a small scale in areas that share a language, because I think actually almost one of the biggest obstacles to European archaeology is language. Like we know about Germans working in Austria, and we know about Dutch companies working in Flanders, and we know about Irish company one working in the United Kingdom. But there just is a real lack of those opportunities, and in many cases there's a lack of appetite for engagement with those opportunities. And this leads us back into our own little national nests, and we don't think about doing things internationally, not nearly enough.
David, you respond on the raised up point, sorry.
That's why I'm very close there are actually so many new possibilities. The language is yes, you're still doing.
Yeah, that's a very good example, but of course, Archaeologists are Franco-Swiss. They're French-Swiss, and they're now pretty much a French company as much as a Swiss company, but it's an example of how companies can successfully operate in other national markets.
Very good. I think we'll second the point about the languages. But if you look at Austria, for instance, and maybe that's why I asked everyone specifically whether there are any smaller companies you know is operating in Austria, is that in the west of Austria, where there happen to be the Germans north of the border and the German-speaking Italians south of the border, companies are coming in across the border. While there's hardly any such interaction from the Czech Republic, from Slovakia, from Slovenia, from Hungary. They are not coming across the border, despite the fact, of course, that the Germans are our old enemies. While all those former Austro-Hungarian Empire countries are culturally pretty much the same. Not to tread on any toes imperially, but I mean, last year in Pilsen, I felt as if I was at home, because I was at home. While, if you go to Germany, they are really strange. Sorry, no offense. So the cultural similarity is ultimately outweighed by the linguistic difference. And that, even though, of course, the Slovak archaeological heritage management system, all those former Austro-Hungarian heritage management systems ultimately have the same roots and therefore are very, very similar. So even when you know the practices, because they are not that different, the language barrier cuts it off.
And I think it is the case of bureaucracy, state laws and so on.
Yeah, but the German laws are much more different to the Austrian laws than the Slovak laws are in archaeology.
I think we have a point to say
ask you one thing about this. You see many northern southern Austrian, Italian people coming to work in this, but not see that are the Austrian companies going to Bulgaria region or to Germany, for example? The share is
well, there's hardly any private companies yet.
Yeah.
Because the Germans and the Italians are basically covering the market.
Well, when I was speaking about the national archaeologies, I wasn't so much thinking along the lines of slavery, because I don't think it's the fact that the private companies can cross the border will change the national nature of the archaeology, because they simply come in, they hire whoever Austrian archaeologists or Sweden with Spanish archaeologists or whatever, but that doesn't mean that the common knowledge, the common heritage is going to be found. I had the experience a few years ago of applying to a scholarship offered by the Bosch Foundation in Germany for public employees to circulate. I don't know if you know about the Bosch Foundation scholarship for circulating among public employees. I saw that Ireland was available in the project, so I then ran. I applied, and I went to interview in Stuttgart. And basically I said that I was interested in going to Ireland to know how Irish archaeology dealt with the issue of property owners of archaeological sites, because it's a huge problem for us. And they just laughed in your face. It's not, this is what finances people. It's just joking. So it means that at the state level and at these levels of interchange of people, exchange of people within even public institutions, maybe we should suggest that happens. When we exchange
experiences and knowledge. Because otherwise they will always be national archaeology.
Maybe a point Kenny was making was something we were talking about the environmental sort of management context that many archaeological practices in Europe came from. The EIA regs, implementation of them, and the ramifications for both developers and consultant practice. However, there are other instruments in European context to look for social and cultural outcomes as well. I think that's what you're touching on, Kenny. Would you like to expand on that a bit further?
At the kind of European
European level, this idea of kind of social inclusion and social cohesion issues that are there in some of the calls, new narratives for Europe, for example.
That's difficult because those things they're not in the core treaty, the treaty that founds the European Union, the treaty that is updated and amended with every big iteration of the core functions of the European Union. I have forgotten the current number of the two key paragraphs for culture, but it's about the essentially phrases about sharing, respecting, enriching, words which can be cleverly used to justify the idea that European Commission money could be spent on culture, into which archaeology falls. But there's not then nice solid things like environmental impact assessment regulations, which have been there essentially accepted by the European Union regulations 1985 and then passed into national law in every country in the European Union and every country that joins, about the whole principles of environmental impact assessment. And that actually, in terms of archaeological practice, has had a lot more impact on more effect on what we do. That, honestly, I think had more effect than the letter in some countries where the letter was so enthusiastically embraced. The idea of there being European cultural, social rather than cultural, social value objectives, that still remains a little bit woolly, a little bit soft. I mean, the ways to get there is there are kind of roundabout ways that you can look at something and say, well, that contributes towards this, it justifies that, but there's not nice, solid things in the Treaty of Union that could really be used in the sense of applying it to archaeological practice. I don't really see them being so obviously there. I mean, there are lots of things out there, like current initiatives like new skills for new jobs, but these always are seen as this is a temporary measure because soon that will be fixed, soon the crisis will be gone. So it's not at core, it is just our response to things. So yeah, difficult.
It's right for common standards.
Well, common standards for best social practice relating to the historic environment would be difficult to convince many. Again, it comes back to national stereotypes and cultural traditions. Many parts of Europe would just not be interested in.
For archaeology.
You mean technical standards?
Yes, we can start there. Yeah. So, because I think one thing that's you said something important, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, that's like you did. Now I go on.
No, that's all right.
Sorry. No, it's that the things outside archaeology and national regulations basically determine what our systems look like and our practices look like. And it's not from archaeology itself that we define our profession. So if this is the point that we lead from, that means that we look at our profession and formulate standards, and from then on we build on what our practice should be, and then the profession. And then wouldn't that be a good start for a European scope?
That's an interesting way, yeah, to think about it, to look at it from the other end.
Yes.
Yes, yeah, we could think of it as being from client end. Some people got recognised clients. That's okay.
Ben's got points and very.
I mean, my point really follows on quite well from yours. I think the issue maybe with lack of single market, in the sense that if you have a principle developed by the archaeology established across the earth, and you have an open market where companies can compete at the European level, then surely standards would naturally come through such processes. Oh, sorry. What I'm just arguing is that the problem is not so much a lack of shared standards, technical standards, it's a lack of a single market. If we have a single market where the principle of development funded archaeology is established in all countries, North and South Europe, then that would allow companies to compete across Europe, and through working in those countries, the standards would naturally evolve. Single standards.
I was just going to say, I think that is good. The problem then being back to core treaties, and that culture is actually, as remember, this won't be treated as being environmental, but it will be treated as being cultural, and so that doesn't apply because culture is a reserved matter that is addressed by national legislation, not by European legislation. But if it could be clearly understood as being environmental issue, yeah.
A couple of responses on those two others. Sustainability and the agenda is the core pillars in this. Yeah? So, Ray?
On the point of the technical standards, I mean, that may of course be a step forward in the way, the technical standards don't exist across Europe and across of course, even though most countries operate in relatively similar ways. But I mean, since it was in our presentation that Austria is introducing an Austrian law, there is of course the European Archaeology. So if you want to introduce a technical norm, all we need to do is to go to the European standards agency and basically try to create a European technical norm. Or even go to the international standards agency and create an ISO norm. For technical aspects of archaeology would be possible. I mean, we need to lobby them because of course they don't make laws just because they're told. But I mean, it would be possible to create something like that. The question is, does that get us anywhere rather than any standard technical sort of norms across Europe? I don't think it would, for instance, solve the common market issue. And I mean, I think the European Union would claim we do have a common market because, of course, if a job is big enough, it needs to go to tender internationally.
Yeah. We're going to take two more questions up there. Mark, you have a point of question?
Sort of a point. The biggest obstacle to getting towards European archaeology is European archaeologists. Because most archaeologists feel threatened by it. Even if you say ethical code, it will be very often. The big secret, the big success of the European treaty, and we take that, it's a great success because some very smart people found a way to make group as a unifying thing, that in essence gave everyone which was part of it room to be themselves. And it's a question about identity. Who am I in the next 5 years as a European archaeologist? And no one, well, even here we cannot answer the question. So the people who feel threatened will say, oh, you don't have the answer, so why should I? Why shouldn't I protect my story, way of doing things, standards?
But are you happy to reason that?
No, but then you know me if you reply.
I know, but I know you can say yes, no, well, no, you can't do the limits, this thing, that. But where's our vision? What do we want?
Well, be a bastard and go your way alone, and then people will tend to follow.
Alessandro, I think.
As one of the technical note, we try to do it in Italy for a national technical impact, and I think it's one of the most complicated things in the world. So for a national norm, I can think the European norm with our 24 countries, for example. And I don't know, internationally, this project of America, for example, I think we should start from the link between us. What for example, could be one of the most important things that makes this project. Knowing not only the numbers, the archaeologists, methodologies, but also the practices, the real practices of our archaeologists. From there, starting to try to find the norm. But for us, first, then with the knowledge, with levels and everything.
From my understanding,
Enormous
the EAC at this moment is working on the common set of standards. So it's already an initiative for the policymakers on the European level. So in archaeology. So interestingly enough, I think that professionals in archaeology on the European level, EAA, are not very aware of what policymakers on the European level are doing and what the real impact will be of that.
We're past our allotted time. Now, while we can stay here for another half hour and talk, it's very hot. It's been a long day. So I think what I would propose is, Callum, Lee, and Kenny, we just have a final comment each. Unless everybody feels that he's not on there, and we'll not keep going. But I think it really has been a long day. It's what people's.
Well, my last bit would be that we would be strategic in the things that we find and not descriptive. So it's not reporting, but we need to echo the things that we know now.
Yeah, good point, Helen. I agree with that, and yes, the little bit that I said there about capacity building and the way that this information mountain we're sitting on can actually be used and applied is key. And yeah, just to reiterate what I said earlier about the value of repetition and the value of, if we really do have a genuine European project, we might not be able to go off and dig holes in the ground in each other's countries, but we are clearly able to cooperate. And this European association, it's an association of archaeologists, it's not of archaeological practice or of archaeology. And I think this has demonstrated a very, very good and I think unusually effective route for EAA to do things.
So in the spirit of cooperation, I'm sure some of us will be going to refreshments afterwards, and you're more than welcome to join us to continue the conversation. But I think on behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank all the speakers for wonderful presentations, and I'd like to thank all the participants for the conversation and for their support for this kind of project.
Yeah. Are you going to the reception thing?